November 7, 2025. A research facility in the Gobi Desert, Gansu Province, China. A reactor the size of a two-story house achieves something no reactor in the world has done since 1969. It takes thorium, a slightly radioactive metal more common in the Earth's crust than tin, and converts it into uranium-233 fuel inside the reactor core, while producing power in a continuous loop. The Chinese Academy of Sciences calls it a success. Caixin Global runs the story. The Western press barely covers it. The reactor is a thorium molten salt reactor. The design is 54 years old. It was invented by an American. The American was fired in 1972 for refusing to stop talking about it. Stay until the end, because the reason the United States did not build this reactor has nothing to do with physics and everything to do with what comes out of the other end of a uranium reactor besides electricity. His name was Alvin Weinberg. He directed Oak Ridge National Laboratory from 1955 to 1973. He held the original patent on the light water reactor, the type that today produces 20% of American electricity. He was not a fringe figure. He was the dean of American nuclear engineering. And in the 1960s, Weinberg became convinced that the reactor he himself had patented was the wrong one. The reason was simple. A light water reactor uses uranium. Uranium reactors operate at high pressure. When something fails, the failure mode is a steam explosion. Weinberg watched the industry expand reactor sizes through the 1960s and concluded that the safety margins were not scaling with the power output. He started saying so publicly. He proposed an alternative he had already built, a reactor that ran on molten salt at atmospheric pressure, a reactor that used thorium as its fuel base, a reactor that by the laws of physics could not melt down. The prototype existed. The molten salt reactor experiment ran at Oak Ridge from 1965 to 1969. It worked, it produced power. It ran on uranium-233, the isotope that thorium converts to inside the reactor core. The engineers shut it down at night by going home. There was no pressure vessel to vent. There were no emergency core cooling systems to monitor. The salt simply cooled and solidified. In the morning, they warmed it back up. 4 years of continuous demonstration. The United States government spent hundreds of millions of dollars on the Oak Ridge molten salt program, and then, when the cleanup costs of the mothballed facility came due decades later, paid another $130 million just to safely store what was left. In 1972, the Atomic Energy Commission cancelled the molten salt program. The Atomic Energy Commission, under Chairman James Schlesinger, instructed Oak Ridge's operating management to remove Weinberg from his directorship. Weinberg was forced out of Oak Ridge the following year. The reactor he had spent a decade demonstrating was put away. The research was archived. The engineers were reassigned. The country moved on. Here is the reason. A thorium molten salt reactor cannot, in any reasonable industrial configuration, produce weapons-grade material. The fuel cycle does not generate plutonium-239 in usable quantities. The reactor that Weinberg had built was, from a civilian electricity standpoint, the safest and cheapest design ever proposed. From a Cold War standpoint, in the year 1972, with the Strategic Arms Limitation talks just signed and the nuclear arsenal of the United States at the absolute center of national policy, a reactor that produced no plutonium was a reactor that produced nothing the Defense Department wanted. Admiral Hyman Rickover, the head of naval reactors, had spent his career building a navy of uranium-fueled submarines. The American nuclear industry was built around uranium fuel cycles because the military needed plutonium and the civilian industry was structured downstream of military priorities. The decision was not, in the strictest sense, a conspiracy. It was a calculation. The United States needed bombs. Uranium reactors made bombs. Thorium reactors did not. The country chose bombs. Here is the honest concession. Light water uranium reactors are not a scam. They are real, functional, and by historical standards safe. They power 1/5 of American electricity. The reason the country built them is not because the energy industry was corrupt in the conventional sense. It is because in 1972, the strategic logic of the Cold War made plutonium-producing reactors a national priority. That logic was rational in its time. The scandal is what happened next. The Cold War ended in 1991. The Soviet Union dissolved. The strategic case for plutonium-producing civilian reactors evaporated. The United States stopped building new nuclear plants of any kind in the 1990s, and the thorium molten salt program, the design that Weinberg had been fired for advocating, did not come back. The country that had invented the reactor, run the prototype, archived the engineering, and held the patents, simply walked away. For 34 years, the molten salt reactor sat on a shelf at Oak Ridge, while the rest of the country debated whether nuclear power had a future. China did not walk away. In 2011, the Chinese Academy of Sciences announced a thorium molten salt reactor program. The Chinese engineering team reviewed the declassified Weinberg-era research from Oak Ridge. They began building. By 2021, they had a small experimental reactor operating. By November 7, 2025, they had achieved thorium to uranium fuel conversion inside the reactor core. They had reproduced and surpassed what Weinberg had demonstrated in 1969. Think about a glow stick, the plastic tube a child cracks at a birthday party. The chemical reaction happens inside a liquid. The liquid is the reaction. There is no pressure, there is no flame, there is no explosion possible because there is no fuel-air mixture to ignite. The chemistry simply runs in the dark until the chemistry is finished and then the light goes out. A molten salt reactor is the nuclear equivalent of a glow stick. The nuclear reaction happens inside a liquid salt. The liquid is the fuel and the coolant and the containment all at once. There is no high-pressure steam loop to rupture. There is no solid fuel rod to overheat. If the salt gets too hot, a freeze plug at the bottom of the reactor melts. The salt drains into a holding tank below, and the reaction stops. Gravity is the safety system. Physics is the safety system. The reactor cannot melt down because there is nothing to melt. Thorium itself is roughly 3 to 4 times more abundant in the Earth's crust than uranium. It is recovered as a waste product of rare earth mining. The United States currently has thousands of tons of thorium sitting in storage facilities, left over from rare earth processing, with nowhere to go. India has the largest known thorium reserves on Earth and an active thorium research program. Canada, the Netherlands, and the United Kingdom have research efforts of varying maturity. A thorium molten salt reactor produces roughly 1,000 times less long-lived radioactive waste than a uranium reactor because the fuel cycle consumes a far higher fraction of the fuel and the byproducts decay to safe levels in hundreds of years rather than tens of thousands. The full menu is this: a reactor that cannot melt down, a reactor that cannot make a bomb, a reactor that runs on a fuel 3 to 4 times more abundant than the one we currently use, a reactor that produces a fraction of the long-lived waste, a reactor designed, built, demonstrated, and proven by an American at an American national laboratory using American taxpayer dollars in the 1960s, a reactor that the United States walked away from in 1972 because it could not be used to make a bomb. A reactor that China switched on, fueled with thorium, and ran in continuous operation in November of last year. 54 years, from Weinberg's dismissal in 1972 to the Gobi Desert in 2025. The technology did not disappear because it did not work. It disappeared because the people in charge of American energy policy in 1972 needed plutonium, and the people in charge of American energy policy after 1991 had no idea the technology still existed. Alvin Weinberg died in 2006. He did not see the Chinese reactor turn on. He spent the last 30 years of his life writing papers and giving talks that almost no one read, trying to convince anyone in the American nuclear establishment that the reactor he had built actually worked. He was right. The Gobi Desert proves it. For the comments, if a reactor that runs on a fuel 3 to 4 times more abundant than uranium, that cannot melt down, that cannot make a bomb, that was invented in America 54 years ago, if that reactor is now being built by China and not by the United States, what do you call that? Not a conspiracy. Not a coincidence. Something else. Tell us the word. If you have ever suspected that the American energy debate is not actually a debate about energy, subscribe. This channel exists to find the technologies that were buried and the people who buried them. Next, while America was arguing about whether to build nuclear reactors at all, Finland solved the energy storage problem with a material that costs $10 per kilowatt hour. It has been sitting in the ground since the Ice Age. That story is next. The reactor was not lost, it was abandoned. Those are different words.